All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is a regular meeting of the Land Use and Transportation Committee. My name is Supervisor Malia Cohen. I'm the chair of this committee. And to my right is Supervisor Weiner, who is the vice chair of this committee. And Supervisor Peskin will be joining us shortly, and he will be sitting on my left. Our clerk is Mr. Victor Young. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Mark Bunch and Phil Jackson from SFGov TV for broadcasting this meeting for us this afternoon. Mr. Clerk, do you have any announcements?
Yes, please silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the May 17th, 2016 meeting of the Board of Supervisors unless otherwise stated.
All right, thank you. Could you please call item 2?
Item number 2, hearing on the first surplus property report to determine if any property should be transferred to the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development to review the process for identifying property as surplus and underutilized for submission to the Department of Real Estate under the property reporting requirements of Administrative Code Section 23A and requesting the Port, San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and the San Francisco Unified School District to report.
All right, thank you very much. I want to take a moment and thank the dozen of neighbors who have written my office and those that have joined us this afternoon in this committee, and particularly want to acknowledge those that took the time out of their busy days to join us today. So, colleagues, what we have here today, you should be able to recognize and have received a packet of letters from our clerk with letters from neighbors expressing their desired use of the Old Poteros Police Station, which is located at 2300 3rd Street. And if you're not familiar, it's a beautiful, just an absolutely beautiful building. It has quite a presence on the corner on 3rd Street. I wanted just to go on record and publicly acknowledge that I share the perspective that the Old Poteros Station at 2300 3rd Street is not the most feasible site for affordable housing development. The current site is occupied by a historic resource in the Dogpatch Historic District, and it's a building that needs substantial investment in order to restore it and also so that the restoration will bring the building back to its historic luster, considering that it is a historic resource. Additionally, the building occupies nearly an entire lot, a very large lot, so there wouldn't be an opportunity to build housing adjacent to the historic police station. It's highly unlikely that we would pursue a development that demolishes a historic building in order to develop an affordable housing development project site. And due to the historic nature of the structure, it is not likely that we would spend our limited affordable housing resources working to renovate it. So, the Dogpatch, many of you know, is a community which is building more than its fair share of affordable housing inside San Francisco. And it's a priority of mine and the community that developers in the Dogpatch developed projects that have on-site affordable units, which is why the vast majority of the new developments in this neighborhood will be building on-site affordable housing. Additionally, the community has worked for years with the real estate division and as well as the police department on the possibility of transforming this beautiful site into an asset for the community, which includes community serving spaces such as a meeting space. I know after this hearing, the Mayor's Office of Housing and the City Administrator will continue to evaluate these sites, but I would urge you colleagues to consider the feedback that we've received and that you will hear in public comment this afternoon. And you recognize the realistic constraints that this particular site has, and I ask that you consider moving it from the list of properties that will be transferred to the Mayor's Office of Housing. So at this point, I'd like to call up our City Administrator, Naomi, who will shed some more light on this beautiful building. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, Supervisors. Naomi Kelly, City Administrator. I just want to kickstart this presentation today. It's myself, John Opdyke from the Department of Real Estate, and we also have the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development here today. Just wanted to give you an insight of the surplus property ordinance that was enacted by Proposition K in 2002. Enacted in 2002 by the Board of Supervisors and amended by the voters in 2015, Proposition K. required the city administrator to report back to you on March 1st the surplus property that we have identified in the city, and MoCD is required to do a feasibility analysis by June 1st. With this short time frame, I just want to give you a kind of a quick overview real quick of how we started collecting the data, what we've been doing since 2002, and the new amendments from November 2015. Real estate would collect data from departments. The departments would identify what is surplus property, and they would provide that information to real estate. Real estate would then report and produce a surplus property report. That report came to you on March 1st and was about 46 properties located in the city. What is new to us this year is the new Proposition K standards, where it further defines what surplus property is, and there's a size requirement of 10,890 square feet, roughly about a quarter acre, and that exempt spaces that were deemed open space. And that became operative this year during our review, and it reduced the list that we provided to you down to that list is being reduced to like 8 properties now that is being reviewed by MoCD. We're thinking about how to clean up this process in the future because this is all new to us. We want to incorporate the future reports into our capital planning process because the new amendments to the surplus property ordinance is asking us to address utilization, building conditions, seismic and historic needs, things of that nature that our capital planning process is in a much better position to analyze than just the self-reported data coming back from the departments. I'd like to turn it over to Mr. John Updike to go through the rest of the presentation on the remaining items the remaining properties that we'll discuss today.
Thank you, City Administrator Kelly. John Updike, Director of Real Estate. Good afternoon, Chair Cohen. So take a look at the first set of properties where no study would be performed by the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, and I'll just very briefly note those. So the first group are zoned POS, which is an open space designation, so consistent with the Prop K language of the amended ordinance for Chapter 23. Those would be exempted. So that's the Portola property, Clipper, and then those parcels along Bosworth noted here. Secondly, 331 Corbett. Again, similarly, you may recall that there was prior board action in 2012 on that item, and there's a specific requirement relative to any potential sale that the funds would go to MOHCD, and a sale would only be to nonprofits to preserve open space. So we felt once again that did not necessitate a study. And then lastly, the Old Mint, technically surplus asset under the definition in the code, but we are moving quite nicely with a request for proposal process there and an interim activation which began just before the end of last year and continues today. So then those parcels left for review that are above the threshold of 1/4 acre are simply, as the supervisor noted, O Potrero Police Station. We certainly take to heart your comments about the neighborhood's concern. I know I personally heard similar concerns in our meetings in Dogpatch over the last couple of years, and our conversations with the police commission, who have a real affinity for this property and desire to see its reuse, respect that older use and connection with the community. And then lastly, a property at, it's really an assemblage of 155 Grove, 165 Grove, and 240 Van Ness. Those 3 lots, when combined, we have a map up, exceed the minimum 1/4 acre site, are not designated historic. That is an item, a due diligence item that has been checked. Our department in collaboration with the planning department. So we do see this as an opportunity for further study. It also could perhaps, maybe take a look at that next slide. Thank you, John. could perhaps afford an opportunity for a creative joint venture combining with the two properties, sort of bookending the city's ownership on Van Ness. So we're happy to entertain discussions regarding that. And with that, I believe I will turn it over to Teresa Yenga, who will talk about the Mayor's Office of Housing next steps.
Forgive me, before we go any further, I just wanted to give Supervisor Kim, who is the author of this hearing, an opportunity to speak, if you'd like. Oh, Supervisor Kim?
Thank you. I believe, did April Veneracion speak
No,
on
I
your
didn't
behalf?
see her earlier, so she hasn't had an opportunity, but I wanted to make
Okay.
sure District 6 was represented.
Thank you. This is my hearing, so I appreciate being
Yeah.
able to speak. April was here to give my talking points, but being that she was not able to, I'll give them now. So in November of last year, the voters passed Proposition K, which is the surplus property land ordinance for affordable housing measure. It makes affordable housing a priority when a public agency wishes to sell or lease unused public sites that are appropriate for housing and sets requirements for minimum housing affordability when public land is developed. The measure established a range of priorities for affordable housing on public lands, all the way from homeless families and seniors and transitional youth to working class families and middle income San Franciscans who are also struggling to stay here in San Francisco to pay market rate rents. In this legislation, we put in more details in terms of the types of housing and development that we'd like to see. In parcels that we believe have the capacity to hold more than 200 units, we expect that not less than 1/3, 33% of the residential units developed on the property must be affordable. For any rental projects, this means that we expect a minimum of 15% to be affordable to households earning 55% of AMI and below. And for home ownership, not less than 15% of units affordable to households earning 90% of average area median income. This is, of course, subject to fiscal feasibility, but we would like to see at least 50% as passed by voters in Proposition K of 2014 of the residential units developed on the property to be affordable to working class and middle income households. All deed-restricted housing developed as a part of these projects should remain affordable for the youthful life of the project. The measure also sets forth a new process for reporting on the city's surplus property as given today. What we found since the passage of the original surplus property ordinance in 2002 is that of the 15 sites identified, that only 2 sites had actually been developed into affordable housing. And in fact, departments were often not listing properties in the surplus property report because they did not want to see it being utilized for other uses. We also want to expand the web of the projects that we looked at so that we weren't just looking at surplus property where there were 0 city purposes, but we also looked at underutilized properties, or we looked at opportunity sites where, for example, there might be a public use, for example, maybe bus storage, but we could build on top of the bus storage to build affordable and even market rate housing if the site is large enough. I do want to thank the Department of Real Estate and John Updike, who is here for issuing their first report since this legislation passed via the voters in November 2015. This list was distributed to the board on March 2nd of this year. The land identified on this list is a public resource and should go forward to being used for the public good. And without this measure, much of our publicly owned land would continue to go underutilized or would be at risk of being sold for market rate development without a discussion of inclusionary housing on site. This is the first annual hearing to provide the board and the public feedback on the surplus property list. And I should add that during this process, we want to make sure that we are getting the full list of all of the real estate owned by all of our city departments, not just ones that are deemed surplus by the city departments itself. This is something that should be examined by the Board of Supervisors, the Mayor's Office of Housing, and the Department of Real Estate to determine which sites are surplus underutilized, or opportunity sites. Giving this jurisdiction to the departments themselves often leads to very little land being produced as potential sites for building affordable housing. And finally, I should mention why this ordinance is so important. We know that in the development of any housing here in San Francisco, that land is often the single highest line item of any development here in the city. If we can take that cost away because the people of San Francisco own that land, then we should prioritize the very thing that our voters have made it very clear that they'd like the city to produce more of, and that is affordable and middle-class housing. Now, we want to make sure that we are looking at a balance of opportunities, but this public hearing is an opportunity for us to look at our real estate options and to see if there are sites that the board would like to move forward and direct the Mayor's Office of Housing to do further work and research on. And so we just had a presentation given by our Department of Real Estate. And next, we do have the Mayor's Office of Housing. We have Teresa Yanga here to comment on the feasibility methodology.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor Kim, and thank you, Supervisors. Teresa Yanga from the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. We just wanted to briefly talk about the feasibility criteria that we would be utilizing to be able to look at these sites to see if they are truly feasible for the development of affordable housing. So first, we would look at the property's existing use, including whether it's a historical use and how long it's been used for that purpose, such as using it as a community garden. If there's community support for continued historical use, whether it be for some kind of community purpose or open space. If there's community support for conversion for affordable housing. Next would be looking at the size and configuration of the lot. Specifically, is it oddly shaped? Does it meet a particular size criteria for us to make a truly financially feasible project? We'd also would look at the project zoning or the site zoning. Is housing even allowed? Will it require a rezoning or a laborious process to allow housing? What is the zoning of the surrounding uses? Also, the height and density, how many units could we truly build? If there's open space required, how kind of open space and how much? And even if it's in a commercial district, is there opportunity to include some commercial development along with the affordable housing? Because we do utilize commercial revenue when we have ground floor retail to help supplement the housing's operations. Next, we will look at site conditions. Specifically, the physical condition of the site. Is it occupied by some buildings? What's the topography? For example, the Corbett site, we looked at that back in 2004, or prior to the transfer over to DPW, that it was a very steep site, and it would be physically not impossible, but very costly for us to be able to build housing with a lot of retaining walls and expensive foundation systems. We would look at accessibility, both by public transit or if it's a site that is not necessarily accessible because of a lot of ramps would be required, as an example. Environmental conditions, toxic site, a lot of remediation would be required. We don't take that into consideration because that adds cost to our housing. What are the surrounding uses? Are there neighborhood amenities such as schools or grocery stores, especially, and then, of course, access to transit, especially for housing for the homeless or very low-income families. When they don't necessarily have cars, we want to make sure that they have good access to public transportation. And then lastly would be the development potential. We would look at the actual physical site to see how many number of units we could potentially develop on it. Is there sufficient space for developing not only the housing, but support services space, community rooms, offices for counseling and support services? Is there space for potential commercial use? Again, as I'd mentioned, when we have commercial uses and have the potential for commercial revenue that helps supplement our affordable housing. Are there alternative uses for the site? Could it be used, if not for housing, what other purpose could it serve? Could we gain some economy of scale on the site if the site is really small? Sometimes it's not financial, it definitely factors into our financial feasibility. Is it going to cost us a lot of subsidy to build a very small project? And is there an ability to leverage outside capital resources? Again, because if the site is small, sometimes it's not economically feasible to find other sources of funding. And then lastly, how much capital money would we be required to provide? And with that, I'll turn it back.
Yes. I do have a question.
Of course.
So over the last 14 years, the surplus property ordinance has been in place prior to the update as passed by voters in Proposition K a few months ago. And since 2004, only 2 of the 15 properties that were transferred to the Mayor's Office of Housing were actually converted into housing for the formerly homeless. One in Supervisor Aaron Peskin's district on Broadway and Sansom, which we recently opened last year. And then in my district on Otis Street, which we converted into housing for formerly homeless veterans a few years ago. I'd love to hear your recommendations on how we can improve the disposition process so that land can be expeditiously sold or disposed for the usage of affordable housing given this rate of production. So given the 15 properties that were transferred to the Mayor's Office of Housing, what can we do to actually implement the surplus property ordinance in a more expeditious fashion?
Well, definitely one of the recommendations that we had was just looking at the properties that were given to us. A lot of the properties from the 2003 list that we received were very small, or they were sandwiched between other residential properties which had no real physical benefit except for the neighboring properties, or we were getting remnants of parcels that would not necessarily be viable for us to build something that would be, again, gain some kind of economy of scale. One of the things that we also found was somewhat cumbersome, but it was very useful to a certain extent, is we had the Citizens Advisory Committee that we had to form and had to actually go through a pretty laborious process to do the feasibility and then vet every single one of those sites through that CAC process.
How many years was the CAC in place? Because I'm not aware of a CAC being in place today, even though it's required by the ordinance.
Right. So the CAC was in place for probably at least 3 years.
So the last time the CAC met was in 2013?
No, actually, it was not until, it was like 2008 or 2009.
So the last time the CAC met was 8 years ago?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Even though it was required by ordinance to continue to meet?
True. But we were necessarily getting properties to be able to evaluate at that time.
I see. So these 15 properties were evaluated by the committee by 2008. So then since 2008, since you mentioned that one of the challenges was going through the fiscal feasibility with this somewhat cumbersome CAC, they did then examine all of these 15 properties. So since 2008, what has been the holdup or challenge to actually building affordable housing on the remaining properties?
Well, as far as I know, that we weren't necessarily getting a lot of properties to evaluate. We were still trying to deal with the...
Oh, I'm asking about the 13 that were transferred to the MOHCD.
Oh, in terms of...
So you've developed 2 out of the 15 that were transferred to MOHCD.
Yeah, actually, I'll let...
150 Otis and Broadway and Sansom.
I'll let John Updike actually talk about the disposition process.
Well, I'm not asking about the disposition process.
Right.
These lands were already transferred to the Mayor's Office of Housing. Right. So when it is transferred to the Mayor's Office of Housing, what is preventing the Mayor's Office of Housing from actually building housing on the remaining parcels?
Supervisor Kim, I'm happy to address that question. So in 2004, there was a rather mass jurisdictional transfer of assets pursuant to the then in effect code requirements from various departments, primarily Public Works, to Mayor's Office of Housing. And as Teresa mentioned, what we're happy that this Proposition K has corrected is the process is now in the right order. In other words, we're going to do the studies of properties and vet them for appropriate development opportunities before we do a transfer. In 2004, the properties were first transferred, and then MOHCD commenced with the Citizen Advisory Committee and my staff's help as well, a review of the property and their efficacy for development. And that, frankly, is why a number of properties, such as on Elmira, on Vermont, on San Jose, Roosevelt, Palu, most of those properties, as it turns out, were either too small to develop or were only possibly sold to the adjoining owner. Thus, we're hostage, if you will, to working out a transaction at market value, because of course we cannot dispose at anything less than market value, or they were simply not developable at all. And they remain in MOHCD jurisdiction. We have not retransferred them back to the home departments.
Got it.
And I'm hoping that this process, now that we're engaged
Got
in,
it.
will provide some transparency and maybe move forward with some either dispositions or other alternative ways of taking care of these remnant parcels. I hope that's helpful.
So, of the 13 remaining properties that were transferred to MOHCD in 2004, how many were sold, as you said, to adjoining property owners?
There were no sales affected to adjoining property owners. There was outreach in '05 and '06, but at that time, if you think of the market dynamics in '06 as we were hitting the peak of '07 before the Great Recession, there was not a way to structure a transaction that made sense for both sides, both the city and the potential buyer, the adjoining property owner.
So all 13 properties are still within the jurisdiction of MOHCD, all the remaining 13.
That is
and they're
correct.
awaiting transfer back to the departments that originally had jurisdiction over them because none of the 13 sites are developable.
Or we are hopeful that with new outreach and a new resource that will be coming on to my staff in the very near future following a solicitation process dedicated specifically to surplus properties, we'll now have an agent whose sole purpose in life will be to deal with just these properties and hopefully structure agreements to transfer them into private ownership, put them back in the tax rolls. That's our goal.
Okay. It would be great to get an inventory of the 13 remaining properties and what the Department of Real Estate is suggesting or proposing that we do. Some of them for sale that can go into the fund to building housing for to build affordable and middle income housing, and then maybe some other proposals for the others. I should ask because I walked in the midst of your presentation, Mr. Updike, that, and this question has come up several times, but how do you identify now underutilized sites? And for an example that will come up is, there was a hearing held over the summer on 30 Van Ness, property that you're very familiar with. It's a site that currently is being used by the city, but of course is being proposed for sale to convert into office or potentially housing. But yet it's not on the surplus property list. And so could you talk a little bit about how we identify sites that we are considering repurposing? I see Naomi Kelly, our city administrator, here to answer that question.
Supervisor, we, as I was stated earlier, that this is a whole new process for us, and so what I am proposing to do going forward is move this to our capital planning process,
Right.
because they're in a much better position than working with real estate close in hand, and Mr. Updike is getting a staff member to focus directly on this issue, that working with capital planning will be able to address the utilization needs, the seismic needs, the historic needs, and many more to determine whether this is an appropriate site to move forward.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Kelly.
And what I'm happy to add is for this particular report, those underutilized sites, rather than look at a new list, we decided to commence this process, we look at what we've already uncovered from the 2 civil grand jury reports and the 1 budget and legislative analyst report. And the BLA report looked at over 500 city properties and identified about a dozen or so questionable properties as to being underutilized, so not vacant, but underutilized. So we began our process with that list and directly queried departments about their current uses. When we were convinced, either through observation and or reports provided, that utilization was indeed stepped up, they did not make the list. For those properties where that wasn't the case, they're on the list. I hope that's background is helpful to you.
Thank you, Mr. Updike. Next, we have presentations by our enterprise departments. These departments are not within the jurisdiction of the ordinance, but we do understand that these departments have significant land holdings, which may be appropriate for affordable housing development. A good example of that, of course, is the site on 17th and Folsom that is owned by the PUC, but will be built for affordable housing next to the brand new park that is currently under construction in that area under Eastern Neighborhoods. With respect to our enterprise departments and SFUSD and City College, the Board of Supervisors may make recommendations of surplus properties and of transfer, but ultimately our enterprise departments and education districts do have a right to determine whether this real property is surplus or underutilized. But we did want to ask them to participate in today's hearing, and I do want to thank all the departments and SFUSD for being here to present today. And we do have the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. I believe Michael Carlin is here to present, and then it will be followed by SFMTA, Kirsten Magary, and then SFUSD. I saw David Golden, Director of Real Estate, walk in, who will be presenting on behalf of the school district. Thank you, Mr. Carlin, for being here.
Thank you, Supervisor. Thank you to the committee members. Michael Carlin with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. We do have quite a bit of land holdings, not only in San Francisco, but our majority of our land holdings are outside of San Francisco. We do look at our properties on an annual basis and look at how they're being utilized. Properties that are underutilized, as we like to call them, we look at repurposing them first within the three enterprises that we run, Hatch Hatchie, the Water Department, and our wastewater enterprise, to see if they would actually be utilized by one of the utilities. You mentioned 17th and Folsom, which actually was a Water Department parcel that we actually traded with the City College for, and we did sell that to the San Francisco Recreation and Park Department and to the Mayor's Office of Housing, and so it will be developed into housing at some point into the future. We continue to look at ways that we could utilize some of our properties that are no longer needed by the utility, and we work with the Mayor's Office of Economic and Workforce Development and other entities as we move forward. But the majority of our focus right now has been on properties outside of San Francisco, where we're looking at some of the remnant properties that are legacy properties from the purchase of the Spring Valley Water Company back in the 1930s. So we can answer any additional questions that you would like, but it is something that we continue to do within the department of looking at our underutilized properties.
Thank you. I was incorrect on behalf of SFMTA. We have Rafi Rabales.
Yes, Rafe Rabelais with SFMTA.
Rabelais, my apologies.
Thanks, no problem. I have a quick presentation. Let me just pull this up. All right, so good afternoon, and presenting on behalf of SFMTA, our Strategic Real Estate Division. Just wanted to say at the outset that this is something, the idea of using public lands for housing is a goal that MTA enthusiastically supports. We know that as a city agency with substantial land holdings throughout the city, we have a role to play in addressing the affordable housing crisis. One of the initial challenges that we faced as an agency is the fact that we have such different properties in different locations. So one of the critical first steps was really coming up with criteria to determine which properties are developable, similar to the criteria that Teresa discussed on behalf of MOHCD. And for ourselves, given that we have such a core important function providing transportation services throughout the city, really the first criterion that we had to examine was the current function and operations of the site, not wanting to do anything from a development standpoint that would really impinge on our ability to provide transportation services. And in certain instances, looking at even the potential to enhance transportation services or enhance our facilities through cross-subsidy, possibly from a development on those particular sites. We looked at the potential for revenue generation, as well as other site constraints like zoning, location, noise perhaps emanating from the existing transit use at the facility. And these were all really outlined starting in 2013 through our Real Estate and Facilities Vision Report that was completed with an addendum in 2014. So some of our initial candidate sites included the Upper Yard, which is immediately adjacent to the Balboa Park, BART, and MTA Station, Muni Station. That property is currently in the process of being transferred to MOHCD, so development process is very much underway there. the Fourth and Folsom site immediately adjacent to the Moscone Center subway station, various parking garages that are not operating at peak capacity. We have some parking garages that in a typical day are 50%, 60% occupied, so we're looking at those. We have about 20 surface parking lots that we're scrutinizing. And then some of the development sites that certainly present some real intriguing development possibilities and are also, not surprisingly, complex are some of the muni yards that we're looking at. We have, as an agency, really devoted substantial capacity to this effort. An asset development manager, which is myself, hired this past summer, and I come from an affordable housing and development background. We also recently hired an analyst to support this effort as well. We've been continually coordinating with OEWD, with planning and MOHCD, meeting with them on a monthly basis on a formal call and speaking with them really on a continuous basis to leverage our respective expertise and skills to this effort. We have a number of feasibility studies that are underway, and just real quickly I can go through some of the project updates. Upper Yard, the concept, so southwest corner of Geneva and San Jose, the concept is a 100-unit affordable housing development. We have executed an MOU with MOHCD that was recently updated. They're in the process of working with BART on a lease option for a portion of the adjacent Kiss and Ride facility related to the BART station. And MOHCD actually issued a developer RFQ in April, and I believe late June is when the responses are due there. At the Fourth and Folsom site, at the northwest corner of that intersection in Soma, the concept, depending on if the ultimate use is family versus senior, anywhere from about 85 units to about 105 units of affordable housing. We have to work with the FTA on this property because the Federal Transit Administration was involved. Their funding was involved in purchasing the property, so that preliminary review is underway. We've recently received an updated appraisal. We're in the process of doing a NEPA review because federal funds will be involved in the development of affordable housing on the site. And we continue to negotiate terms of the MOU with MOHCD. We've done some very preliminary outreach to stakeholders in the area, and certainly as the process moves forward and after our MOU is executed with MOHCD, there will be additional public outreach and a developer RFQ to follow. Surface parking lots, we have about 20 total. We're looking at 5 in depth now. We procured consultant services, architectural services, as well as a financial consultant this past November, and a draft report will be completed this month. They will recommend the appropriate housing and potentially public parking mix for 5 sites. One is in the Market and Octavia area, adjacent to the Performing Arts Garage. There are 2 lots in the Castro, 2 in the West Portal neighborhoods. We'll do some preliminary public, in West Portal neighborhood, excuse me. We'll do some preliminary public outreach as the draft study is released, and really with the ultimate outcome being at what affordability levels development is feasible and whether or not development is feasible given the kind of relatively small size of these sites. And then finally, the muni yards. Really, the critical piece here is just the operational needs and constraints of the agency. These are all of the sites that we're looking at are very much functioning muni yards that accommodate bus storage as well as bus maintenance. And the fleet and facility needs are kind of ever-changing. We're expanding service. Of course, we've done a couple of service expansions within the past year, and and all of the projections are that our fleet, both in terms of light rail vehicles and buses, will continue to increase. So the sites that we're looking at are really currently being evaluated holistically as part of the overall vision report update that we're doing in Facilities Capital Program, and how taking those facilities offline during the construction period for a year to 2 years, how that would kind of fit within the capital needs that we have and programmatic needs that we have in terms of providing transit services. So following the assessment of how these development sites would fit into that capital program, we would then follow up with detailed feasibility studies for these sites that would look at everything from financing and how like a residential use or a mixed use could perhaps cross-subsidize improvements to the facilities, to various code and design and architectural considerations. So with that concludes the update, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And first of all, I do really want to appreciate that SFMTA has been working very closely with planning and the Mayor's Office of Housing and our office to build affordable housing on the Fourth and Folsom site. We really appreciate that collaboration and partnership over the last couple of years. And It's great to see that SFMTA is really looking very closely at its portfolio to identify sites for affordable housing, given I know that MTA has tremendous use for the land that it owns. So it's very appreciated, and I think it's great that we're looking at surface parking lots. And I'm also actually very interested in the Moscone 3rd Street garage as well. And in some cases, even building on top of existing use, like the Kirkland bus yard and Supervisor Peskin's district, so that we can keep city purposes, but really use the full potential of these sites by potentially building housing on top of it. Now, I know SFMTA has their own process of identifying sites that are surplus or underutilized, and could you talk a little bit about how it determines what sites are surplus or underutilized?
Sure. Yes, those criteria were, as I said, initially kind of outlined as part of the 2013 Vision Report. And
in the what report? I'm sorry.
Vision Report. So it was a real estate vision study that was done for basically the entire suite of SFMTA facilities. And the criteria, I wasn't part of those discussions as individual sites were being reviewed as it preceded my time at MTA, but really the first criterion and most important one was just the use of the site, and whether, in talking to our transit folks, whether or not it was a site that could potentially be taken offline, or if it was absolutely critical. Continuous use was absolutely critical. Another factor was looking at the need for upgrades. That's the case with some of the yards where there is a need. We know at some point that they're older facilities and there is a substantial need to upgrade those facilities. So we know at some point there will have to be, those facilities will have to be shut down for an upgrade to be made for a major capital investment. So the idea of doing vertical development, transit-oriented development as part of that rebuild makes those sites promising candidate sites. Other factors are location within the neighborhood, zoning, again, size and development capacity, similar to the analysis that MOHCD has done on their holdings, where obviously not all properties are created equal in terms of their development potential. So those are really, those have been kind of the initial criteria that we've used to look at sites, and I suspect that as we have some real development wins and some of these sites are indeed successfully transitioned to a residential use or mixed use, along with MTA uses, that we'll probably do another pass at all of our, or a number of passes at all of our land holdings, and see whether or not there are other candidate sites that could be added to that list.
And so do you look as a criteria sites where you may be using 100% of the parcel, but we could build on top of that current use?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the case especially with the yards. There's all sorts of engineering challenges, and there are complex development sites, but obviously there's air above that we could look at. So.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Next we have David Golden from the Director of Facilities and Real Estate at SF Unified School District. Thank you so much for being here today. We really do appreciate the school district being here to present on this item, regardless of whether the ordinance has jurisdiction over school properties. So thank you.
My pleasure, Supervisors. So I'm David Golden, the Chief Facility Officer for the school district. As you know, we're one of the major landholders in the city. We actually own about 9 million square feet of land area, over 150 sites. The interesting thing about us is, contrary to public perception, most of our sites are actually pretty full these days. If you look at our surplus property list that we created about 9 years ago, 3 of those sites are now returned to active school sites. Some of those properties have in fact been sold, and I'll talk to you about it in a minute. And we're actually now pursuing actively new locations for new schools, because we project over the next 20 years we're going to have anywhere from 6,000 to 14,000 new students in San Francisco Unified, predominantly out in the Bayview, Mission Bay, and other housing areas. So it's an exciting time for us. You should know that we're an agency, well, you do know this, of the state. How we dispense a property is governed by the California Education Code, and it's mainly set up to protect school districts from having fireside sales of property to balance their budget, so they make it incredibly tough to sell property. You need to go through a very elaborate process of declaring property surplus, public hearings, and once you sell property, a school district can only use it for facility-related purposes. So the intent would be a school district might want to build a school, you might want to sell property, but if you want to buy textbooks, you need to find monies a different way. So with that framework in mind, what is not being used in our portfolio, I'm very pleased to say we're working very productively, I think for the first time in many years with MOHCD and the real estate office. You may know 3 or 4 years ago, we actually sold a major piece of property back to San Francisco State on Font Street. Last year, we closed escrow for 1950 Mission with MOHCD, where there is a affordable housing project in the works. And last month, another one of our empty lots, we just closed escrow with MOHCD in real estate at 1101 Connecticut, and that'll be part of Hope SF. And we are currently working collaboratively with the Mayor's Office of Housing on a joint workforce and teacher housing project where we sort of have a site in mind and we're not quite ready to go public with it, but we're hopeful that that's going to come to pass as well. So the collaboration is strong. If you look at our portfolio of empty land, I think we really only have one lot left, and that's 7th and Lawton, where we sell Christmas trees and pumpkins.
Pumpkins.
And I would love to do something because we haven't actually ever made that much money from Christmas trees and pumpkins. But it's a difficult lot in that we have a community that also sees it as preservation of open space. But with that, I'll be happy to open questions. I think it's an exciting time for the school district, and if all of this housing we're talking about gets built, we're hopeful we're going to have a lot more kids in our schools. It should be fun.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. And this is certainly a very different conversation than the one we were having when I was on the Board of Education, where we weren't looking at an increasing enrollment and certainly not a very quickly growing San Francisco population. And so it's actually exciting to talk about building schools versus closing schools, which was certainly a conversation 10 years ago. And I am, I want to be very cognizant of the fact that SFUC needs to consider conserving sites for population growth. And actually, one of the questions that I had, and maybe it's not a question, actually, it's just further discussion with the Mayor's Office of Housing, is to looking at multiple uses on a singular site, knowing that we are restricted by our 7x7 boundaries. And so if we have identified a site to build a school, Mission Bay is not a great example of that, of course, but if there are other sites that we look at school, housing, or maybe even other uses that benefit the school district as well. And I also appreciate the tremendous work that your department is currently collaborating with Mayor's Office of Housing on how we increase housing for our teachers, who we learned, I think, in September through the task force that there's not a single home that is affordable to a household where both income earners are teachers in San Francisco. And I think that was certainly very startling data for the board to hear in the fall. And we certainly need to do a lot more to address that crisis if we expect to have quality teachers here in SFUSD. We want them to be able to afford to live here as well. But we do look forward to working with you, and I hope that we are able to be more creative about the limits of existing land here in San Francisco. And thank you so much for the presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you, supervisors.
Finally, our office did sit down with City College of San Francisco. They were not able to present today, but had made clear that there were only 3 parcels in their surplus property list, and that is 33 Goth, the Civic Center campus at 750 Eddy Street, and Balboa Reservoir. And so all of their other sites are actually being utilized for educational purposes. We're aware of all 3. And certainly affordable housing is being slated for at least 2 out of those 3 sites. And so we look forward to working with City College. So, Madam Chair, that is all of our presentations for this hearing, and we can open up for public comment.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a few public comment cards. I have 5 here. I'm going to call them. And if there's anyone that would like to speak on this topic, item number 2, that hasn't filled out a card, please feel free to come up to the... excuse me? Where? Oh, I've just been brought to my attention that Mayor Art Agnos is joining us in the chamber. Mayor, are you speaking on item 2? Are you speaking on item 2? Please come up. We'll start with you. John Werner, you'll be following the mayor. David Glover, you'll follow John. Catherine, you will follow David. And Jared, you will follow Catherine. Angelica, if you're here, you can speak after Jared Dumani. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and committee members. I want to thank you for your leadership on these issues, as well as your collective leadership. But before I begin, may I ask, do you do the 2-minute gong?
Yes, that's right. You'll hear a soft chime indicating that you have 30 seconds remaining, but you have 2 minutes.
I just would remind the clerk that there is a rare and not very often used rule that former mayors get an extra minute for every year they were in office, should that be necessary.
We may ask follow-up questions, Mr. Mayors.
Thank you again. I would respectfully suggest that my history with affordable housing, both low, middle, and affordable of all kinds, has been shared with you over the course of my career, and especially in the last few years when we become particularly aware of the acute problems that you are discussing. I am here to lend credibility and respect to an extraordinary woman who you will be hearing from, who is a leader in the Dogpatch community as well as the greater Potrero Hill area that has been one of the most instrumental community leaders I've ever experienced. Indeed, if she had been with me when I was mayor, I probably would still be mayor because of the kind of work that you will hear her talk about in the community. And in particular, we're talking about the old historic Potrero police station and hospital, which we need to convert to a community facility and open space while protecting and preserving its historic facade. This is a badly needed facility because while we are properly adding to the stock of affordable housing and housing in general in this part of the city with enormous projects that are going up as we speak and will continue in the pipeline for the next 10 years, we aren't keeping pace with the other kinds of facilities that we need. So as you listen to Ms. Dumani, I want you to know that there is an entire community that is following her leadership in this extremely important project. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Next speaker will be John Warner, followed by David Glover.
Greetings, my name is John Warner. I'm a business owner that's cut a corner to the site and just wanted to reiterate the initiative of the Dogpatch Neighborhood Association and other community members who would advocate for community-centric, most likely nonprofit use of the space, regardless of what direction it goes in. I would like to ask the city to consider expediting any type of solution so that the property will at least be utilized as opposed to the eyesore which I've experienced for 5 years as a business owner across the street. And definitely want to reiterate the importance of the historic fabric of the neighborhood and specifically retaining that property, the building, restoring it as opposed to scraping it and building something new. Thank you.
Great, thank you. David Glover.
Greetings, David Glover, Potrero Hill, and I also spend also in Dogpatch about 2 or 3 times a week. It's very much a part of my immediate community. This is also to urge you to not use the Potrero Police and Station and Hospital for affordable housing, and consider that it be converted into a community center or be made available for that purpose. When I was a boy and a teenager, my family and I lived directly across the street from a community center, and we kids in the entire neighborhood knew that we had a safe and supervised place to go for ping pong, billiards, arts and crafts, athletic activities. I would also attend events with my parents, including low budget but very entertaining Broadway-style musicals prepared by children and adults in the community. Exactly how this location would be used in that context would need to be determined. San Francisco is in desperate need of affordable housing, but we probably should not turn every square inch of space into housing only. People of all economic backgrounds need homes. We also need places that can help keep us safe, make life interesting, give us opportunities to share with each other, and create memories of our time together. Supervisor Cohen pointed out there's going to be quite a bit of affordable housing still coming into Dogpatch. So it also would seem especially appropriate given the historically community-serving nature of the police station and hospital that it be used for a community purpose such as a community center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Good to see you. Catherine Dumani, followed by Jared Dumani, followed by Angelica, followed by Charlie and Jesse.
Good afternoon, Honorable Land Use Committee members. We as a community are requesting that the site of the Old Potrero Police Station and Hospital should be removed from the surplus property list for conversion to affordable housing for the following reasons. Dogpatch has and is making enormous contributions already to the affordable housing crisis that we all agree needs to be addressed. In fact, the Eastern Neighborhoods Planning Code is stricter than the rest of San Francisco, and in our neighborhood, any development larger than 5 units has to provide at least 15 to 20% of its units below market rate. So let's do the math. Of the 2,500 units, that's 2,500 units that are being built, scheduled, or to be completed by 2020, 100% of these 24 projects are over 5 units. Therefore, they're contributing between 250 and 500 units or their equivalent in affordable housing land or funds. And as Supervisor Cohen had mentioned earlier, the Dogpatch Neighborhood Association encourages developers to build their affordable housing on site to prevent economic segregation. So, despite this robust pipeline of development in Dogpatch, we're mysteriously lacking public benefits that were promised in the 2008 Eastern Neighborhoods Plan, which is what led to this tsunami of development in the first place. And I quote, it said, the Eastern Neighborhood Plan proposes to provide a full array of public benefits, including open space, public transportation, improvements, streetscape improvements, and community facilities. But to date, the city has made little material progress on any of these fronts. So the community has done the work themselves. In 2008, the Omega Boys Club and Good Tidings built a new basketball court at I.M. Scott. 2012, we built a new preschool at the same site. Open Space, 2012, Progress Park, and many others. So my point being that this property, especially due to its historic status and already a tremendous amount of affordable housing being contributed in our neighborhood, should be dedicated to our community. And we have identified potential financial resources to do the work on the property itself. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jared, did you want to speak?
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Angelica Cabande, and I'm with SOMCAN. Thank you, Supervisor Kim, for your leadership in having this item on the agenda today. San Francisco is a small city, 7 mile by 7 mile, and land is definitely extremely precious resource, which majority has been engulfed by luxury condo developments. That's why it's a no-brainer that city sites comes back to public goods, which is right now we're in a housing crisis. It's really important that affordable housing is built for San Franciscans. And we need to remind our public agencies that in this moment of a housing affordability crisis, sites like 4th Street and Folsom, 30 Venice, and other sites are very important to be dedicated back to the community. Land is more valuable for the long-term public good than the money an agency might get from selling. As at SOMCAN, we see not only evictions and tenants getting harassed, but also every day we see people asking and begging us to help them find housing, like Esther's family, who was forced to live in a SRO, and due to the SRO units having a maximum amount of people being able to live there, her family had to actually divide itself and move into 2 to 3 other buildings. Therefore, their family is not together. The children is away from their parents, and the older kids are watching their siblings. This is not the kind of family cohesiveness or how we want to see families grow in San Francisco. Our community looks forward to working with SFMTA and MOHCD on transferring the site at 4th Street and Folsom, including investigating 3rd Street Garage at Moscone for more affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Jared.
Wasn't fast enough on that one.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, members. Thank you for your time. I wanted to continue a little bit on what Catherine was saying in regards to the historic nature of the property. This is an Italianate building. It could be fabulous. It is now just kind of mired in decrepitude. In the 15 years that we've been living in Dogpatch, nothing has been done to help this building other than a fence being put up and reactions to fires being set by homeless people living in the building. And it is definitely a building that needs to be saved, and the time is well past for it to be done. We have funding lines that we've identified and think that we can get this done, and ask that you remove it from the surplus list. One other thing, I have 2 letters, one from the Dogpatch Neighborhood Association supporting this, and another from a neighbor who wasn't able to get it in through email.
All right, we'll take those letters and put them in the file. Is that it?
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Next is Charlie, followed by Jesse.
Good afternoon, members of the Land Use Committee. My name is Charlie Shamas. I'm with People Organizing to Demand Environmental and Economic Rights. Thank you, Supervisor Kim, for your leadership on this issue and for holding this hearing. We've heard during the course of this hearing that the accomplishments of the Public Lands Ordinance has been relatively modest over the last decade, but we've also learned that where it has been successful, the results have been very impactful. Over the last 6 months, the Mayor's Office of Housing has been in a very unique position as compared to the last decade to initiate development on public land at least 3 different sites in the Mission and the Excelsior districts. 1950 Mission, which is formerly a San Francisco School District site, 17th and Folsom, which is a Public Utilities Commission site, and the Balboa Upper Yard, which is formerly a MTA site. This came about after years of community-based planning and advocacy efforts to win the city over as a partner to develop new affordable housing and open space. Now that it's happening, it feels very sweet. This is exactly what we should be seeing more of. How do we keep the momentum going? Community organizations and residents are eager to partner with the city in this effort, but we need tools to make it happen. We need the city to resource community-led planning efforts. We need commitments that the city not privatize these lands. We want to keep them in the public realm, turn to our own city agencies with the mission and expertise to develop affordable housing, and we want the city to land bank, even if we don't have the resources now to pay for development. A prime example is the Balboa Reservoir. We have real concerns. Why isn't the reservoir on this list? 17 acres, publicly owned land next to a major public education facility, nestled in a neighborhood with many working families that are severely impacted by the housing crisis. It comes around once in a generation, a site such as this, and yet the city is proposing a majority market rate development on the site. We understand that the PUC requires fair market value, but it does not require market rate market housing. And so we would like your support and to make sure that the reservoir is considered appropriately as a public lands development site. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Thank you for your time. My name is Jesse Fernandez. I'm with Poder as well, and I'd like to say that I'm excited for this time to be able to move forward to develop sites for affordable housing, much needed affordable housing, not just for the opportunity to house people like teachers who can't afford to live in the city, but the parents of the children who those teachers are teaching. In my area of work in District 11, it's a highly immigrant, low-income district with a lot of families with children who are going to these schools, and if the housing that is developed isn't accessible and affordable to these families, we risk a lot more than we risk losing the cultural diversity in San Francisco, which is certainly under attack by way of the housing crisis. In fact, according to a recent article in the Examiner, we've far exceeded our market rate housing and are way, way below housing that's going to be accessible to low income, very low income, and moderate earners. One such site that I want to highlight, piggybacking on our previous speaker, is the Balboa Reservoir. This is going to have a potentially very high impact on the ability to provide affordable housing for low-income, very low-income folks in San Francisco. But to date, the process has been stymied, and the parameters are not reflecting community pressure. I want to highlight the high profile and the high opportunity of this publicly owned site, and echo that it should be developed as affordable housing, as affordable and accessible to low income, very low income, and moderate earners, and not market rate. Thank you.
Thank you, supervisors, and thank you for hearing this item. Thank you also to the enterprise agency representatives for coming forward and speaking about properties under their jurisdiction. I just wanted to give, my name is Fernando Martí. I'm with the Council of Community Housing Organizations. We worked closely with Supervisor Kim in developing the Prop K ordinance last November. One thing I want to say to the folks from Dogpatch, I think as advocates for affordable housing, we absolutely want to respect the work that you're doing to preserve that building as a community center. The one thing I would add to that is if you want to see some fantastic work that affordable housing developers have done in terms of preserving historic buildings, I invite you to check out the Third Church of Christ Scientist on Haight Street, which is now affordable housing run by TNDC. And the work that affordable housing has done as a catalyst for creating community services, check out what Booker T. Washington is doing in the Western Addition. I think one of the important things about Proposition K is that not only does it talk about prioritizing affordable housing, but it also talks about other uses for public sites, including community facilities. I think one of the things that we heard today that is really critical is how the site at Grove Street, just across the street from here, has come forward to as an probably an indispensable opportunity site for developing affordable housing right here in the vicinity of City Hall. And I think we need to look more closely at this. What I think I'm hearing as well is, as the MTA put forth, is the tremendous resources that are available under the MTA in both bus yards, parking garages, parking lots that might be co-developed as affordable housing while maintaining those critical uses on the ground floor. A lot of work to be done. Finally, I just want to reiterate what we wrote in the Examiner. Please do not privatize public sites. Please keep public lands in public hands. Thank you.
I want to give a follow-up and reiterate the fact that every time Supervisor Kim and the Land Use Committee talk about affordable housing and you set the rate for low income and affordable housing and you set the percentage of the medium at 55%, which is a total of $41,480 a year in order to be eligible to apply for these buildings. Okay? People who are in low-income brackets range from about $18,000 to $30,000 a year. Okay? So they're not even eligible to move into these apartments. You did the same thing with the Civic building that's about 2 blocks away, right next to the Department of Public Housing. You claim it's low income and below market rate, but yet the 55% rate is $41,450 a year. People who are in that income bracket are not at below low-income housing rates, and it's delivering an adverse effect. You did that with the 5M building. You claimed that it's low-income and affordable housing, and the lowest income to be acceptable to move in that building at 5th and Mission is $71,000 a month. You got senior citizens, and especially females from the Filipino community, coming up here voting for 5M, and you got them thinking that because of that measure that they'll be able to move into affordable housing. You build that building, after it's completed, those same senior citizens, females of the Filipino descent, will try to apply to move in that building and be told that they don't have enough income because the entry level to move in the building is at $71,000 a year. It's not fair. And I'm real upset and disappointed that you keep advertising low income, but you set the income rate for acceptability at that high amount. It's disgusting.
Supervisors, I'm Jim Haas. I'm on the board of the Civic Center Community Benefit District. I want to make a couple of comments about the Grove and Van Ness property. It's in the Civic Center Historic District. Now, the Historic District is not just a bunch of buildings. It includes the very important 1912 plan developed by John Galen Howard that has certain restrictions. It calls for all the buildings facing City Hall to have a 70-foot cornice line plus a story above. There are architectural requirements and whatnot. What I'm getting at is that that property cannot be used to build a cheap building because of the requirements of the historic district. So that is a constraint. The other matter I want to bring to your attention has to do with safety. The performing arts organizations in the area are growing and include thousands of people, many of whom are older. Some come from out of town. The area at night is insecure for a lot of them, and that corner is particularly troublesome because it's so dark and undeveloped. Also, later in the evening, a criminal syndicate operates an illegal recycling operation there where they pay scavengers and drugs and cash for cans and bottles. That property needs to be developed in a way that accommodates all the different requirements, including housing. Our CBD has written a letter saying we're in favor of housing, but because of the odd configuration of the private and public lands and other things, it's a tricky situation, and you cannot impose upon it any particular arithmetic percentage of what you can require there. It requires working through the design and whatnot, and then coming to a consensus as to what would be appropriate in terms of affordable. And I urge you to get on with this project because that corner just sits there vacant and insecure and needs attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Peter Cohen, Council of Community Housing Organizations. I, too, just want to remind folks what great leadership, Supervisor Kim, you had in putting this measure to the voters last November. It passed 75%. So clearly, folks like the idea of using our precious public resources for affordable housing. A few suggestions just on the nuts and bolts of implementation. Certainly, what I think we were all looking for was a current list of sites, not recycling. I mean, the idea is to habituate every year. The departments go through a process of, combing through their inventory and making sure that that list is updated, that it's current, and that it's thorough, and not just recycling. So as we go into this next cycle with a sufficient amount of time in advance, we hope that gets done. Related to that is really the new creative opportunity to think about underutilized sites. And that can be defined in a lot of ways, and I like to hear the departments talking about the trickiness of doing that. But the point is we need to be creative. We are in a 47-square-mile city. We hear a lot of folks talking about doubling the size of the population, whatever it might be. We obviously have to maximize efficiency of site use. So let's figure out what that means. We do have two properties already built. We have affordable housing at Bartlett Street over an existing garage, and it works really nicely, so we know it can be done. A third point is we need to actually get our enterprise agencies to work with us to do that kind of annual reporting, and I'm glad you asked them all to be here today. But if we can actually sync that up so that they're doing everything on the same schedule with the same transparency and the same process, that treats all the departments, enterprises, not as part of a city family and, frankly, part of a civic project. And lastly, the public needs to know what's going on. One of the things that we did in working on this measure was to actually create more transparency. This is an extremely bureaucratic process that most people don't follow. So having a notification list that's automatically sent out to interested parties is really key, and we need to figure out how to establish that list and how to have automatic notification. And lastly, to the previous speaker's point, Balboa is a perfect example of why we don't want to privatize these sites. Only 17% of that site is scheduled for affordable housing. The rest is all at 120 to 150% of AMI housing, plus market rate. These should be affordable housing sites. They're a precious opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Seeing no further public comment, Chair Wiener, could we please close public comment?
Public comment is closed.
Thank you. I do want to thank members of the public coming out to speak on our surplus property ordinance list. The purpose of today's hearing is to have a public hearing on what is reported as surplus and underutilized, but also to get community input in terms of how they would like to see surplus property to be utilized. So I do want to thank different residents coming to speak on how they would like to see sites in their neighborhood utilized, not just for affordable housing, but perhaps for community center space and open space. This is the time to have that type of discussion. I also do want to recognize Choo Choo and some of our affordable housing advocates who did work with us on crafting the surplus property ordinance, or the re-envisioning of the surplus property ordinance last year in 2015. Thank you for your work in helping us draft this. This is an ordinance that has been in place since 2002, and we want to work to both strengthen but also articulate some of the specifics of this process so that we can have better outcomes with our existing property, our existing publicly owned property. We know that we are in the midst of an unprecedented and widespread housing crisis, despite building more housing than we ever have since the 1906 earthquake. And we have a vast and increasing majority of residents from formerly homeless all the way to middle-income San Franciscans who make very good income here in San Francisco. They can't afford to live here. In fact, 75% of San Francisco residents are shut out of this housing market. And so middle-class families that earn between $80,000 and $150,000 aren't confident that they can raise their children here, aren't confident that they can live in the city that they work in. I did want to address one of the comments made by a member of the public in regards to this ordinance. We do prioritize first housing for the formerly homeless. So we offer a range of housing that can be built on surplus property, and that is our first priority. And then we move on to affordable housing at 55% of average median income, and then to middle income housing. As to the comments about seniors, in the 5M project, they have deeded a parcel within their ownership to be built for low-income seniors, and it would be available to seniors at a third of their income, regardless of what their income is. So there is housing on site specifically for seniors that isn't at the 80 to 150% average median income. It could be for seniors on fixed income, and they will only be expected to pay a third of their income for rent on that site. I'll finally end with this quote from the San Francisco Business Times, who doesn't always agree with all of our policies, but they said in a recent article, quote, affordable housing developers have an easier time building on public land because the city can transfer the property directly and prioritize affordable housing on these sites. On privately owned sites, nonprofit developers have to compete for land acquisition, end quote. We know that publicly owned land is a limited commodity, and that we should be very thoughtful in terms of how we utilize it, and also make sure that we are maximizing its usage to consider multiple uses on one site, whether it's housing, public purpose, or community center sites. So I do want to thank everyone for their involvement. I want to thank our enterprise departments and the school district for attending our hearing. I do want to thank the Department of Real Estate, both John Updike and, of course, City Administrator Naomi Kelly. We know that as we move forward with a revamped surplus property ordinance, that we look forward to working with you on making our vision a reality. So without any further comments from committee members, Chair Wiener, may I suggest that we make a motion to file this item?
Okay, we will entertain a motion to file item number 2. Can we take that without objection? Without objection, item 2 is filed. And Mr. Clerk, will you please call item number 1?
Item number 1, resolution approving the addition of the commemorative street name Gene Compton's Cafeteria Way to the 100 block of Taylor Street in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the turning point for civil rights movement for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex people, and in specific the contributions of transgender women.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Kim is the lead sponsor of this, and I'm a co-sponsor. Supervisor Kim.
Thank you, Chair Wiener, and thank you for your co-sponsorship of this item along with Supervisor David Campos. The resolution that is before us today is to rename the 100 block of Turk in the San Francisco Tenderloin neighborhood the Gene Compton's Cafeteria Way, commemorating the August 1966 uprising of primarily transgender women leaders that sparked the modern LGBTQ rights movement. The Compton's Cafeteria site marks the location where an all-night cafeteria existed, the Gene Compton Cafeteria, catering to the Tenderloin neighborhood, where 50 years ago exactly, a group of outraged transgender women and gay men stood up to police brutality, marking a turning point for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender liberation. This commemorative signage on its 50th anniversary is designed to memorialize the Compton's riot event at its half-century, to remind us that we have much more to do, to remind us of how far we've come, but how much more there is to do to combat the insufficient institutional infrastructure and lack of cultural tradition for our trans women community member. The statistics in our that the transgender community faces are staggering. According to reports, 41% of transgender individuals report suicidal thoughts during their transition due to traumatic life events. 26% report losing a job over their gender identity. 19% report violence and or abuse at the hands of a family member or loved one. In the realm of the LGBT violence, transgender women, especially transgender women of color, bear the brunt. 72% of victims of anti-LGBT homicide are transgender women, and 67% of anti-LGBT homicide victims are transgender women of color. And this is a statistic that is held true every year. Transgender people of color are 6 times more likely to experience physical violence from the police as well, compared to their white cisgender survivors and victims. While a number of states are placing protections for transgender individuals, other state governments are expressly enacting laws stigmatizing transgender lives by expressly forbidding any new LGBT or transgender-oriented anti-discrimination bills being passed in their states entirely. And I do want to recognize Chair Wiener for his work on resolutions that ban travel to these states that do not accept all of our brothers and sisters. As the 50th anniversary of the Compton's Cafeteria riot approaches, and as as our Trans March approaches in June, we wanted to commemorate this event by renaming the 100 block of Turk to Gene Compton's Cafeteria Way, and we want to recognize the Department. We want to recognize the Department of Public Works in their efforts to help expedite this, so that we can do this in time for the Trans March in June of this year. I also want to recognize many members of the public, in particular Felicia Flames, who is here today, for her leadership in educating all members of this board and the community on this very important event. In fact, in my first year in office, Ms. Flames came with a poster to educate me on the significance of this site in the district that I represent, along with other members of the board. So colleagues, if there are no further comments, I would like to open up for public comment.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Just briefly before we go to public comment, thank you for taking the lead on this renaming, which is a really positive step forward. And we know that in supporting and embracing any community, recognizing not just the present, but also the past and how the past led to where we are today is extremely important. And so this recognition, which generations of San Franciscans going forward will be able to see and remember and be educated about, is incredibly important. And I agree that particularly with what's going on in other parts of the country in terms of attacks on transgender people, it is more important than ever for San Francisco to remain in the lead in embracing our transgender brothers and sisters. And we know that now that we won in the Supreme Court on marriage equality, that those who want to demonize and attack the LGBT community are quickly pivoting to other issues, and one of those issues is attacking transgender people. And so we need to rally as a community and show unity, and this is a step in that direction. So thank you. And so at this point, we will open it up for public comment.
Thank you, Chair Wiener.
Hi, my name is Felicia Elizondo. I'm also known as Felicia Flames. I am a screaming queen, a pioneer, a legend, an icon, a diva, a 29-year survivor of AIDS, a Vietnam veteran, and last year's 2015 Lifetime Achievement Grand Marshal, and this year's the Brother Kelly Collins Service Award that's given out by TNDC. I just want to thank Supervisor Kim and Scott Wiener for being here, because it's very important for the transgender community. And it wasn't a transgender community, it was queens, queers, sissies, hair fairies, female impersonators that did all that work for us at the time that the Gene Compton's cafeteria riot was, because we were thrown out like trash. We were sick, we were mental, nobody wanted us, so the Tenderloin wasn't a word of mouth. It wasn't in the news or in the media. It was word of mouth, where girls could come in and be who they were without being scrutinized by other people. We were murdered, raped, beaten up, thrown in jail because of who we were meant to be. We could not go anywhere else but the Tenderloin, and we were very happy to be there, although we had to do prostitution because they wouldn't hire us for work, but we had to jeopardize our lives to be survivors. I wanted this Gene Compton's cafeteria away because I want to give memory to all the girls and the boys that stood up for all of us at one time to be who we were meant to be. We were fighting for our rights. We were fighting for who we were meant to be. And I want to honor them all who died there, who have been killed, murdered, and raped there because of who they were. I just want to, I am the only one other than Tamara Ching, Susan Cook, and my manager, I forgot her name, God, senior moment. I just want to make sure that our history as queers, sissies, jotos, female impersonators, street workers, hustlers, we were all together. We were all one community. We were the gay community, blacks, Asians, African, Mexicans. We were all together fighting for the same thing because we had the right to be who we were meant to be, regardless of who who cared for us and who didn't care for us. We had to be who we were meant to be. Thank you for this honor. I hope it does go on, and hopefully I get to celebrate the 50th anniversary at City Hall. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Elizondo. Thank you for your leadership on this and also for your leadership on the renaming of Vicky Marlene Way in the Tenderloin 2 years ago. That was a historic street renaming, and I was proud to work with you on it. And I'm really excited to present you next Tuesday at the TNDC dinner where you will be awarded.
Hello, I'm Jasmine G. Thank you for hearing us. Just technical, I heard 100 block of Turk. That was already renamed. It's 100 Taylor.
I'm sorry. That was yes, the 100 block of Taylor. Thank you for the correction.
I'm a good friend of Felicia, and I'm also representing Challenge March. I'm one of the vice co-chairs. I'm also part of a community that will have a conference in less than 2 weeks, the Howard Grayson Elderly LGBT conference using the Cadillac Hotel, and the theme is on the Gene Compton's cafeteria. So we're getting the word out so people know about Compton's and not just Stonewall. So we want the whole city and the Bay Area and the country to know about Compton's cafeteria. So thank you for getting this done for us.
Thank you, Ms. G. And also thank you for your leadership on Vicky Marlene Way as well. Vicky Marlene Lane. Vicky Marlene.
Good afternoon. My name is Jordan Gwendolyn Davis. I'm a transgender woman who now lives in the Tenderloin. Obviously, I'm a lot younger than, I don't remember when it happened because it happened before I was born. And I support honoring the rich history of trans women in San Francisco by naming a street after 1966 Compton's cafeteria riots. And yes, they were riots. Because of these freedom fighters, San Francisco is far ahead in terms of transgender rights. However, trans women, especially trans women of color and disabled trans women, face too many issues locally, such as being murdered, unemployment, criminalization of sex work, homelessness, not being able to access our surgery program, gentrification and the loss of resources, incarceration, and police violence. I believe that if we were to take a lesson from this historical event, it's that disruption is still a relevant and necessary tactic. Though there's a time and place for diplomacy, when the marginalized or oppressed, we are willing to put our dignity over your decorum, just like Jenicet Gutierrez did last year when she disrupted Obama over the abuse of trans immigrants. We need more of that. I would like to say to those certain officials who gentrify and criminalize, you will never support LGBT rights, no matter how much you wrap yourself in the rainbow flag. If you're going to accompany your support of trans rights with racism, ableism, and classism, just don't come to the Trans March or any other trans events. And I'd like to close by giving out solidarity with the Frisco 5 and the general strike, which is, of course, happening outside, as these two events, 50 years apart, are linked by police violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis.
My name is Austin Padilla. I just wanted to get up here and say that as a gay man, it was queens like this and the people with makeup who made it so that I would even have a chance to be involved in local politics or Supervisor Wiener, someone such as yourself. And the more research I did about this, there are no SFPD files on the case. The mafia paid off the SFPD to destroy the files, and I think that this does speak on behalf of what's happening in other states, but also on behalf of what's happening right outside City Hall right now. And the fact that trans women are murdered in the Tenderloin and across the city, and even in places in San Francisco, we see violence against the trans community. And people in the city don't know what Gene Compton's cafeteria was. They don't know what it represents to this community. And so anything that we can do from inside these walls to commemorate and to remember the history, I have to thank Supervisor Kim because she's not LGBT herself and still prompted leadership on this commemoration. So thank you, Supervisor Kim and members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Padilla.
Is there any additional public comment? Please come forward. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ray Rucci. I'm a proud transgender woman, a law student, and currently a law intern in Jane Kim's office. I want to thank you for entertaining this proposal. I think it's important to have a memorial and Gene Compton's site in the Tenderloin because it's important to memorialize what transgender people have done, especially transgender women. And I hope you pass this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any additional public comment on item 1? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Okay. Supervisor Peskin, could I have a motion to forward item 1 to the full board with recommendation?
So moved.
Okay, without objection.
Can I make a, sorry, sorry.
I'm sorry, Supervisor Kim, I didn't see your name on there.
Thank
Supervisor
you.
Kim.
My apologies, I didn't press a button. I do want to thank Chair Wiener for your co-sponsorship of this, along with Supervisor David Campos, and also want to recognize Supervisor Aaron Peskin has just joined on as a co-sponsor as well. I forgot to mention, along with thanking Public Works for expediting this, I also want to recognize SFMTA, Dylan Ayang, who's also here, for also working very closely with our office to expedite this so that we can do this in time for Trans March. We were led by the example of Supervisor Peskin in his district for renaming near the Chinese hospital, and we were able to utilize that method to expedite this as well. And finally, I just want to thank Bobby Lopez and Austin Padilla from my office for their work and working with the community to make this happen, and we look forward to doing much more to commemorate this very important event in San Francisco's history and certainly in the Tenderloin neighborhood. Thank you, committee, for your support.
Okay, on the motion to forward item 1 to the full board with positive recommendation, we'll take that without objection. Mr. Clerk, is there any additional business before the committee?
Just to restate the recommendation is to recommend the matter to the full task force without objection with Chair Cohen being absent.
Yes,
there is no other business at this time.
It's to forward with a positive recommendation.
With the recommendation, yes.
That's correct. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.